So what I'm going to do is I was looking at the schedule and seeing how many more days we have before we have to finish history of aviation. And I've taught careers in aviation. The way the plan is to the second hour for the first half of the semester is history, and the second half of the semester is careers in aviation. Careers in aviation is less difficult than history. Yeah, sorry, there are no essays. Careers in aviation. I know everyone's going to be disappointed about that. There is a lot of research, but the way I structured the class last time, and it worked pretty good, is we're going to do the research in class. And in any case, I'm also seeing that it's harder and harder. I'm not catching up in private pilot ground school. It's not catching up. And to be able to spend more time in the lab, to reinforce what we learn in ground school, you don't have to spit it out. Could you put that package away? Thanks. In order to spend some time in the simulator lab and reinforce, there's just not enough time to cover all that stuff. So this is what my plan is. I wish everybody was here, but too bad for them. So number one, I'm going to catch up in aviation history so that we can have the final exam on, does anybody remember the day the final exam is? The 12th. Okay, so I came to a decision this morning. The final exam is worth 20% of your score in history. It's going to be 20 questions, and it's going to be open note, but you're only going to get 30 minutes to take it. So that gives you 90 seconds. It'll all be in order. It won't be mixed up. So it'll go boom, 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 and every question in there, there'll be about 2 questions per chapter. And I'll just say, chapter 01, or do the Wright brothers, the decade before World War I, stuff like that. So you'll be able to flip to that chapter really fast. So I figure it'll take you about 30 seconds to get to the right chapter, and another 30 seconds to, actually it won't take 30 seconds, it'll take you about 5 seconds to get to the right chapter, it'll take you about 30 seconds to find the answer, and it'll take you about 30 seconds to a minute to write it down. So maybe I'll give you 35 minutes to do it. If anybody has an objection to having an open note test that is to do it, if you'd rather, we can have a 40-question test, and it's closed note. Would anyone, and I'll give you the entire 50 minutes. Would anybody prefer that? For history. Would you prefer a 20-question open note final exam next week? Is not the final exam next week on Thursday the 12th? Somebody tell me I'm wrong. Okay, it's worth 20% of your grade. In history, I'm not talking, I know no private pilot ground school company. So aviation history, it's 20% of your grade. We got 2 choices. 40 questions, it's closed book, you get 50 minutes. Or we can do 20 questions, it's open note, but you only get 35 minutes to take it. Which would you prefer? You got to have pretty good notes. Who'd rather have the closed note test, 40 questions, 50 minutes? Raise your hand. One person. Okay. Because he's going to get it done. He knows all the answers. He's going to be done in 15 minutes. No, I'm not. Either way, the questions are going to look just like the quiz questions. Either way, the questions are going to look just like I'm not saying they are the quiz questions. I don't mean that at all. No, I mean, I'm glad you're thinking about what's inside my head, because that's exactly what I'd be doing. It's like, all right, how's he going to screw me the other way? Yeah, okay. No, literally what I'm going to do is I'm going to take last year's final exam, and which was not open note, and I'm going to whittle it down to 20 questions, and I'm going to look at it and go, okay, do I believe that they needed to have written this down? Yes. And whether or not you wrote it down, that's up to you. All right, so officially that's what we're going to do. The syllabus doesn't say anything about how to handle the final exam. It just says we have to have one. So it's official. That's from tomorrow. It's going to be open note. What's going to happen if you don't bring your notes? You're going to be very unhappy. I mean, you can still sit there and try to answer the test. You can study it. So that's the downside, is you got to bring your notes every day. It's official. Thursday the 12th at 2:20, we're going to take the quiz. Correction, we're going to take the final exam. It's going to be open note, and it'll be 20 questions, and you only have 35 minutes to take it. All right. So in order to catch up in aviation history, I need to not lecture in private pilot ground school for a day or two. So we're going to do aviation history for 2 50-minute blocks today. And then we'll go back to normal tomorrow, I think. I think we'll get enough covered today. But then we'll have covered all the history that I wanted to cover before the final exam. And then, after the 12th is over, when we get into the second half of the semester starts a week from this coming Monday. So that's October 17th, I think, is a Monday. That's the first day of the second half of the semester. We're going to start careers in aviation. But the careers in aviation is only going to take about 30 minutes. So we're going to, every day in private pilot ground school, we're not going to go for 50 minutes before we break. And I know we've been going over, but we're going to keep going over every day in private pilot ground school. We'll probably, instead of 50 minutes, we'll probably go an hour and 10, take a 10-minute break, and then have 30 minutes left. Because I want to get through private pilot ground school. So, to make it easier for you, I'm going to do for the rest of the semester in history what we're doing in private pilot ground school. And this is for the space age. We still have to finish. You still need to pull out your notes because we still got a few more things about the Cold War. We still got a few more things about... Oh, wait a minute. Shucks. You need the second page, and you need that page, and you need that page. Okay. And you need, that one goes on top of it, and this one goes under it. And that one goes on top of that one, and that one goes under it. You already have that one? And so you have two? Okay, all right, and that goes under there. All right, so you can put that away. We'll get to it today. Let's finish the Cold War. So we were on the slide, so this is part 3. So we're on the 08. The chapter is 08, part 3. And I think this is October 4th. Whoops. So we were on this slide when we finished. I think I was talking about air-to-air missiles. Of course, even in the 1950s, supersonic fighters were the norm. Nobody was making almost no subsonic fighters. The only thing the U.S. military has that's subsonic in the way of a fighter is really an attack airplane like an A-10 or an AV-8 Harrier jump jet. The Marine Corps flies the Harrier. They'd take them off and land off of small aircraft carriers, and they're designed for close air support. That is, they're right at the battle lines, and they fly just past it and shoot the bad guys who are right there on the battle line. Same thing for the A-10, which is flown by the Air Force. So other than those ground attack airplanes, which are subsonic, nobody has fighters that don't go supersonic. And of course, one thing that happened in the middle of the Cold War is bombers got built that could fly around the planet. In fact, you don't have to write this down, but the first time an airplane flew around the world without touching down and stopping for gas was the United States Air Force B-52. I think there was more than one of them. It did aerial refueling, but it flew 24,000 nautical miles around the Earth without touching down because it could use aerial refueling. Of course, the B-52 even then had like an 8,000-mile range, so they only had to refuel 3 or 4 times. But if you take off out of the United States and you want to kill the godforsaken commies, you could just refuel once maybe, and you'd have plenty of gas to get there. So 8,000 miles, you refuel, fly another 8,000 miles. How many bad guys are more than 16,000 miles away from the United States? Nobody, because that's halfway around the world. You can get to anywhere else on the planet 16,000 miles from where we are. And of course, some people's personal favorite is attack helicopters. Attack helicopters really kicked in, not in the Korean War, but in the Vietnam War. There was a couple of helicopters in the Korean War that had machine guns on them, but they were used a lot in the Vietnam War. If you were going to ask Mr. Johnson what were the significant fighter planes of the Cold War, and if I hadn't said it, you ought to write it down. When was the Cold War over? You got to put this in your notes right in there. The Cold War was over in 1991. And you're saying, Mr. Johnson, what makes you think it was 1991? Well, the Berlin Wall came down just before that or just after, but it was early 1991. And the reason I picked that day and time, that time, is because that's when the United States Air Force took its bombers off of nuclear alert. I was actually on nuclear alert in Minot, North Dakota, in early 1991. And the wing commander of an 06, a full colonel, came out to the alert shack, the alert pad, which the colonel had never done, and had us all in the big briefing room. And he actually turned on a TV set, and there was old President Bush, not young President Bush, but President Bush Sr. And he came on. The Cold War is over, and we're not on nuclear alert anymore. So the colonel reached up and turned off the TV and pointed towards the crews and said, go out to the airplanes and turn all the switches so it's not ready to go and go home. Because normally when you went on nuclear alert, you'd go out and you'd pre-flight the airplane, you'd pre-flight weapons, make sure all the switches were in the right place, so when you ran out to the airplane, you could turn everything on really fast, take off really fast. Remember those ICBMs, those missiles, are going to nuke that Air Force base. So you got to get off the ground and get far enough away that you don't get blown up. And then for a week you'd be on nuclear alert, and you'd have to stay near the airplanes. So if the horn went off, and I say horn, I mean the alarm. If the alarm went off, you'd run to your airplane, start everything up, and then go take off and stuff. Yes, Brandon. Well, I think it would be rather interesting right now if you were talking to the United States military and they could tell you military secrets, which they wouldn't. It would be rather interesting. Do we have any B-52s or B-1s or B-2 bombers that we have them? But do we have any just sitting there and we've just not told anybody and we put some nuclear weapons on it and we've set them up and they're ready to go? They're effectively on alert. We just don't tell anybody. I think it wouldn't surprise me if the answer was yes. I'm not a military nuclear strategist, but it wouldn't surprise me. But you also need to understand something, that nuclear bombs only weigh about 2,000 pounds, and you can fit them on the bottom of an F-A-18 fighter plane that launches off of a United States aircraft carrier. Now, it may not be, let me phrase that, that's my opinion. Now, I haven't been keeping up on this for a while, but a 2,000-pound bomb is not that big for an F-18. And if you were really, really smart and you wanted to have everything to have the maximum capability, would you not want to have a Navy fighter on an aircraft carrier be able to take off, fly 300 miles, drop a nuclear bomb, and turn around and come back? So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the United States Navy has some nuclear bombs. And I'm saying this, not that I know, but if you were a military strategist, you might think about it. Guess what? You know what? We have military bases in Japan. Kadena Air Force Base is on the island of Okinawa. I flew B-52s in there. The Japanese nationals didn't like it very much because B-52s are nuclear bombers, and they would have protests outside the base. We flew there from Guam because there was hurricanes coming, and we didn't bring any weapons. But Japanese citizens protesting, I'm sure that's their right, and I think everyone has their right to protest peacefully, certainly. But what other places are there? You could put an airplane in Guam. It's only 4 hours from Guam. You think we've got 52s in Guam right now? Oh, I bet all kinds of money. I bet all kinds of money that there's B-52s in Guam. And I know when I was there, the United States Navy had a big bomb depot. And they kept lots of conventional bombs, as in TNT bombs, not nuclear bombs there. But just because I know that they kept conventional bombs there doesn't mean nuclear bombs there. I just never asked. And nobody tells you if you don't need to know. They don't tell you. Because then you can't give away secrets. So they only tell you things you have to know. So, you know, there's an Air Force base in Anchorage, Alaska. Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. So there's a boatload of ways you could do things right now if you wanted to do that. Okay, so back to jet fighters of the Cold War. The two ones that came out in Korea were the MiG-15, which here's a nice picture of a MiG-15 on the right, and there's an F86 on the left. Wow, about the same shape, about the same size. Wow, they were very comparable airplanes, and I haven't memorized. Probably one's a little faster, and probably one's a little more maneuverable, and probably one works better at high altitude, and maybe one's, you know, a little faster or something like that. But they were very, very comparable airplanes. And the first time jets were trying to shoot down other jets, a full jet-on-jet dogfight, was in the Korean War in the early 1950s, in the middle of Korea. And it was U.S. pilots, which most of them, well, a lot of them, I won't say most, a lot of them had experience as fighter pilots in World War II, versus North Korean and Chinese pilots who did not have combat experience. The United States pretty badly in dogfighting because the United States pilots had experience, and people who were teaching the new American pilots, they had a lot of experience. And both of these airplanes could not quite go supersonic. They could go supersonic in a dive. So here is, which one? The MiG-25. It's got two engines. It'll do a couple times the speed of sound, and a comparable airplane was the McDonnell Douglas F4. The F4 is interesting because it was one of the few airplanes that the United States Marines had, the United States Navy had, and the United States Air Force had. The Army and the Coast Guard were the two of the 5 military services that didn't have it. And the F4 was one of the biggest, baddest fighters of the Cold War. If you don't bolt too many things on it, like this thing has a lot on it, it would probably only go about Mach 1.5, 1.8. But if you drop off the gas tanks, it would go. It would. I know for a fact if you didn't have anything bolted underneath, it would go Mach 2 straight up. And 1-pound weapon underneath this thing. So if you can bolt more than one, that means you can bolt just one. I'm not saying I know what kind of a 2,000-pound weapon, but the attachment points on the center of this airplane could hold more than a 2,000-pound weapon. And we flew these off of aircraft carriers and by the Navy and the Marine Corps, and the Air Force had a ton of these. So let's just say, what's the significant thing about this slide? The significant thing about this slide is the first jet-to-jet dogfight was in Korea between an F-15 and an F-86 in the early 1950s. And in the early 1960s, a decade later, in the early 1960s, both the Soviet Union and the United States had Mach 2 fighters and had a lot of fun. Oh, just so you know, remember the F-104 we talked about yesterday? The F-4 had the same engines, except 2 of them. So you could carry a lot of fuel, and you could carry a lot of weapons, and still go really, really, really fast. All right, so why don't we just take a look at these airplanes first, and then let's decide what to write down and is important. The B-36 Peacemaker. Now you got to remember that first airplane that dropped nuclear bombs was the B-29, and they put bigger engines on it, and that was the B-50. But another company came out, and they put 3 engines, 3 engines per side, a total of 6 reciprocating or piston engines that were even bigger than the B-50. And it's hard to see in this picture, but if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the wing, or bottom right-hand corner of the screen, this is actually an engine pod with 2 jet engines in it. And there's actually one on the other wing, which is hard to make out. There's 2 engines. So this thing actually had 6 piston engines that had 4,000 horsepower apiece. 6 piston engines that had 4,000 horsepower apiece, and then 4 more jet engines. And this was designed as a nuclear bomber. But even with the jet engines on it, it was doing about 350 miles an hour on a good day. But it could fly all the way and drop bombs on the USSR without aerial refueling. So it couldn't go that fast, but it could go a long way, because this airplane did not have aerial refueling. If you want to see a really good movie about the B-36 Peacemaker, watch a movie called Strategic Air Command with Jimmy Stewart and June Allison. I will not ask you that on the test. Okay, so for a long time, for about 5 or 6 or 7 years, this was like the most awesome, biggest, baddest, longest range nuclear bomber on the planet. This B-45 is the first production jet bomber in the world that was designed from scratch as a bomber. On each wing is a pod, is integral next to inside the wing is 2 engines. So this is actually a 4-engine bomber. So it had a pilot and a navigator and a bombardier, and it could go. It was all jet, so it was doing 500 plus miles an hour. It didn't stay in service very long. In the early 50s, the Peacemaker, the B-36 Peacemaker, it didn't get replaced. The Air Force just added the B-47. This is made by Boeing, and it actually has 6 engines. On each wing is an engine pod with 2 engines, plus an engine pod with just 1. And on this airplane, between engine pods, you can see that there's a fuel tank. This thing, you had to do aerial refueling, but now it would go jet speeds. It'd go 600 miles an hour. You'd have to air refuel to get to the commies, and so you could drop nukes on them. It had a pilot, a co-pilot, and a bombardier who was also the navigator. And now we finally had a really fast 500-mile-an-hour nuclear bomber. The B-52 was built started getting built in the mid-50s, and they built them all the way into 1962. They had built over 700 B-52s, the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H models, and every time they built it, it was better and better and better. The H models are the only ones that are still flying, and I think there's 76 H models still flying based in Minot, North Dakota, and in Shreveport, Louisiana. And that's the airplane I've been talking about a lot. It'll go 10,000 miles without, it's a newer version that has better fuel economy. It'll go 10,000 miles without gas. So you could take off out of Guam, fly all the way to North Korea, drop all the bombs you wanted, fly around for 3 or 4 hours, and then come back, and you wouldn't have to do any aerial refueling. And maybe you could only fly around for 2 or 3 hours. Yeah, it's crazy. And it'll carry, for training purposes, you could tell the computer, this is unofficial, this is okay to say this, you could put 24 warheads on it. This one doesn't have anything bolted under the wings. So I like the B-58 Hustler. Remember that engine that was in the F-104, and there's 2 of them in an F-4? This has the same engine, but it's got 4 of them. This was the first Mach 2 bomber. It would go Mach 2. Now, you couldn't go Mach 2 the whole time. It burned up too much gas. But if you were getting chased by a missile, you could go, and push the throttles forward, whoosh, and speed up to twice the speed of sound to keep from getting hit by the missiles. If you want to see a really great movie that has 58 Hustlers in it, you need to watch a movie called Fail Safe. Fail Safe. And it's a story of a B-58 that gets launched. And the United States decides to recall it. But their little gizmo in there that decodes the messages for the recall is broken because the missile blew up nearby and it broke it. So they actually go to this guy's house and grab his wife and get her on the radio, trying to talk to the pilot that's 3, 4, 5,000 miles away, trying to convince him. Because the rule is, according to the movie, once they launch you, if you don't get an official recall code, you're going to drop your bombs no matter what. I mean, the president gets on the radio trying to talk to him, and then they get his wife on the radio, and I'm not going to tell you what happened because I don't want to give it away. So I like Mach 2, super Mach 2 bomber, sweet. Okay, now here is the Russian equivalent. This is a Tu-95. This is the Russian equivalent of the B-52. It'll carry about the same amount of weapons. It'll go about the same distance. It's about 50 to 80 miles an hour slower because it's got propellers on it. But the United States built a lot of B-52s. The Soviet Union built a lot of Tu-95s. The Bear bomber, they still have theirs. The United States still has its nuclear bombers. And they also got built started getting built in the mid-1950s. So if I was going to say what's important on this slide, I'd say that the Tu-95 Bear, yes, it's the fastest propeller-driven ever, but this was Russia's, or the USSR's main nuclear bomber. And the same for the B-52. Of all these bombers, the B-52 was used on nuclear alert more than all of the other ones added together. And what's interesting, I think, is that they were similar in weight, how many bombs they could carry, how far they could go. I think that's rather interesting. Compared to today's bombers? Well, in the United States, today's bombers, there's still some B-52s, there's some B-1s, and there's some B-2s. And the B-1 will go supersonic, and it'll carry about the same amount of bombs as a B-52. So it's a better airplane. It won't go quite as far without refueling. Right? You know, you could refuel once over the North Pole, and it could still get to what used to be Russia. But I don't think we're going to go to nuclear war with Russia. So nuclear war with North Korea is an interesting discussion, which we'll try not to have today. And the B-2 bomber, it doesn't go supersonic, but it's a stealth bomber. It doesn't show up on radar. So you just go flying at night, you drop your bombs, they can't even pick you up on radar. That's awesome. B-52s, they pick you up on radar. Any questions? All right, I want to talk about the three most awesome cargo transport airplanes. Yeah, Johnny. The last bullet point is the Tu-95 has the world record, even though it's a nuclear bomber. It has the record for the fastest propeller-driven ever. It has jet engines that are spinning the propellers. But and they've taken it up past 500 miles an hour, but they had to overhaul the engines when they were done. They ruined the engines. But that's okay. They set a world record. It cruises around 400 miles an hour. Oh darn, not 500. But you can fly across the North Pole and not gas up. So. Yeah, when they got the world record, it's hard to see in this picture, but there's actually two sets of propellers on each engine. They're counter-rotating. One spins clockwise and the other spins counterclockwise. And not that this isn't a great design, but they said, you know what, we want to have the world record for the fastest propeller-driven airplane. So they just, let's see how far we can go. And they got to the red line on the engine, and then they kept pushing the throttle forward. And they knew they were ruining the engine. It's not like they didn't know it was going to happen. They wanted to break the record. So, you get the world record, you look cool, and all you had to do is, if it's only $2 million per engine, it only cost you $8 million. As far as the budget of the Soviet Union military, I don't think that's too much. So let's look at the C-130. The C-130 got started building in the late 1950s, and it's still in production. They're up to the J model. They're still making them in Georgia, the state of Georgia, not the country of Georgia in Eastern Europe, but the state of Georgia, the one next to Alabama and Florida. Lockheed is still making the C-130. They've got better engines on it, and they've made a lot of inputs to it. But if you put a new C-130 up next to it and they had the same paint, you would absolutely know that they were the same airplanes. Pretty much all you'd notice is that the propeller blades look different. If you stop them, the newest airplane, the J model, has propeller blades. So this, you can't put big tanks in it, but you can put like big giant trucks and howitzers, and you can throw troops out of it with parachutes. And since it's a turboprop, it'll fly slow, and it'll take off and land. You can actually take on this and off and land on a dirt strip that's only a couple of thousand feet long, so it's really good for that. The C-5 Galaxy, now this thing you can put tanks in it. Literally, you can put tanks in this thing. And it's way bigger. It'll carry more than twice as much as that C-130, probably about 3 times as much. It's 2 or 3, I used to know. I was looking at a picture. The tail opens up, but on this airplane, the nose cone actually lifts up, and you can move things in from the front. There's actually a top level up there that has like 20, 30 seats in it, up there at the same height with the cockpit and everything. The entire bottom of the airplane is wide open. I've only walked through one of those. I've never been in flight in one of them. But they're awesome. And you can, and it'll go, 500-600 miles an hour, but it takes a big, long runway. So this is the Antonov AN-125, which is extremely similar to the C5 Galaxy. And in fact, if you didn't know about the biggest difference between these two airplanes, other than the fact that one's made in the USA and one's made in Russia, is that the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, on this airplane, you'll notice the horizontal tail comes out of the center of the fuselage. And I don't know if you can see it on here, the horizontal tail, it's called a T-tail. You see how the tail up there, that horizontal stabilizer is at the top of the vertical fin, it's at the top of the rudder. So that's the biggest difference that most people, if they didn't look for that, they wouldn't notice it. But the C5 Galaxy also has a nose that opens like that. The back end opens too. And they both, they weigh they weigh about 800,000 pounds. Yeah. Well, everybody's got a different opinion. One nice thing about the high tail is that it's hard for trucks to run into it by accident. There's probably some other aerodynamic issues, and I just don't know what they are. I know on a little tiny airplane, like a Piper Tomahawk that has a T-tail, that tail is high enough it's not in the propeller. So when you push forward on the throttle and pull it back, more or less air doesn't go across it. So it doesn't change the air going over the tail. So the airplane doesn't pitch up and down very much, as much, I should say, when you move the throttle. The airplanes like this, if they had a propeller on the front, the propeller slipstream is going across the tail. So when you change power settings, it changes how much is going across the tail. So if I had a degree in aeronautical engineering, I'd have known your answer. I'm sure there are some advantages and disadvantages to both. The previous airplane to the Galaxy here that Lockheed made was a T-tail. But here's what's funny. Lockheed, this will go, whoops, wrong way. Lockheed made this C-130, the same exact company. And this has the tail on the bottom of the fuselage, not up the top. So same manufacturer. So my guess is it can't be amazingly critical. So just for fun, here's a picture. Just for fun, here's a fun picture. So this picture right here is the C17 Globemaster. This is the latest and greatest thing that the Air Force has going right now. It's smaller than a Galaxy, but look at the size of a Galaxy versus a C-130. When I say it'll hold, 3 times as much, I think I was underestimating it. Whoops. So right above this C5 Galaxy is an AN-124 that we were just looking at with the nose flipped up. Look at these two airplanes. Extremely similar in size. This giant job up here, it's the AN-225. They only built one of these. You notice it's got 3 engines per side. They built this specially to fly around the Soviet Union's space shuttle. Their space shuttle never went into space. But they built one big old honking airplane to fly it around. You'll notice here is the A380. This is currently the heaviest airplane out there. It's about 1.3 million pounds. It's made by Airbus in France. And then below it is the biggest 747-800. It's longer, but it's skinnier than the Airbus A380. The Airbus A380 is a little bit heavier. So these are the 2 biggest airliners ever made, and these are the 2 biggest military cargo airplanes ever made. The nice thing about this Globemaster is that they specifically designed it, and I won't go into the details. It won't land on as short a runway as a C-130 Hercules, but it'll land on a lot shorter runway than the C-5. And I think the C-5 will hold 3 tanks, and the Globemaster, the C-17, will hold 2. So the inside of the airplane, I think, the diameter is almost as big. So if Brian Sandoval was here, I'd ask him, so you want to fly one of these when you go in the U.S. military? So what would I say about this one? I would say that in the Cold War, the only new cargo airplanes, they all had jet engines. and they were big. Maybe huge is a better idea. I guess you'd have to write really big. Is that what huge is? Huge is just really big? Sorry, I don't know what the nickname is for AN-124. So let's talk about nuclear missiles. Everyone likes to talk about nuclear missiles. So you need to understand that the four-letter abbreviation ICBM, that stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And that's what's in the news about North Korea, because they've just developed the technology to have an intercontinental. A ballistic missile is one that goes way up and then it comes way down. And when you say that it's intercontinental, it means it can go from one continent to the other. So in this case, if you're a military leader in the United States, you're thinking about the continent of Asia that North Korea is in, and the continent of North America where the United States is. So I haven't been keeping up. I don't know what's the farthest distance an ICBM out of North Korea has actually flown, but I can tell you, based on completely unofficial sources, that the intercontinental ballistic missiles that the United States has can reach anywhere on the planet. So we could launch them from North Dakota and what's on the other side of the Earth. It's like, yeah, I think it's the southern. Is it the southern Pacific Ocean or is it the Indian Ocean? Because we're in the northern hemisphere, so if you went to the exact opposite of the Earth, you'd be below the equator. I don't know I think you're right. I think it is the ocean. So ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And so here is a very early one. If you're familiar with early space travel in the 1960s, this was the rocket we used to put the second U.S., or maybe it was the third U.S. astronaut in space. You may have heard of a guy named John Glenn. He was the first U.S. astronaut to orbit the Earth. This was the rocket that they put him on. Guess what? That rocket, before it had a man on top of it, it was an intercontinental ballistic missile. In fact, the Gemini program, where we started in the United States in the mid-'60s, where we had 2 astronauts, the rocket that launched those people, it was an intercontinental ballistic missile that we just said, hey, let's put some people on top. Woohoo! What's that? What's that? Yeah. Because this would put a capsule with one person in it into orbit. And once you go into orbit, you can land anywhere you want. Just a little rocket here, you land over there. A little rocket over here, you land to the other side. And I think in space, just so you know, if you're outside of the capsule and the little rockets go, you can't hear anything, right? But can you hear it if you're inside the capsule? I think so. Because there's air or metal between you and the rocket. So if you're inside the capsule, which most of the time that's where you want to be, I'm pretty sure. I've never been to space, but I thought about it. When I was a kid in the early 70s, they had space food. You could buy space food. It was just like dried peanut butter in a stick. It's kind of like if you took Play-Doh in about a half-inch diameter cylinder that was about 6 inches long, and you let it set out for 3 or 4 or 5 days, it would start getting kind of hard like chalk. Maybe you have to leave it out for a week or 2. That's what the space food was, except they put sugar in it, so it tasted good. Did I ever go to space? Heck yeah, tomorrow. I'll go tomorrow. I mean, I think maybe I need more than a day of training, but, if I had my choice, you're either going tomorrow or you're never going, I'm going tomorrow. I promise I won't touch any of the buttons. Show me how to turn on the oxygen on my spacesuit. That's what I want to know. I want to know how to turn things on, the oxygen on. And where's the button I push if the pilot doesn't know what they're doing? Oh, wait, show me how to use the radio. Show me how to use the radio. I think that's maybe the most important thing. Heck yeah, would I go into space? I'd pay money for that. All right, here is the Gemini program had the two people in it. Started out ICBM. So there's 2 big rocket engines down there. What's the color of the exhaust coming out of the rocket engines on this? What does it look like? Clear or light blue? So what do you think The fuel is oxygen and hydrogen. Yeah. So look, this is even launching. You can see the bottom of the screen. This is launching out of an ICBM complex. It was under the ground. Okay, so those are examples of a couple of ICBMs. You also need to know what SLBM is. SLBM stands for Submarine Launched Ballistic Missiles. You're going, what? Submarine Launched Ballistic Missiles? Yeah, they put ICBMs inside of submarines, and then they swim them around under the water so you don't know where they are. So if you attack their country, they will aim those submarine missiles at you because you couldn't destroy them in advance. How many submarines does North Korea have? They have the largest submarine fleet in the world in number of submarines. They don't have any ones that will carry a nuclear missile, though. So we don't care about them that much. And we care about them a little bit because they can launch torpedoes. So if we're going to send a Navy carrier group, an aircraft carrier close to North Korea, you think we're sending other ships that are looking for submarines? You think we're doing that right now? If North Korea has more submarines than any other country? Yeah, you better believe we're doing called ASW on the test. ASW stands for Anti-Submarine Warfare. You can take a helicopter and you drop the thing on a wire, and it goes under the water and it listens. It uses sonar, it listens, and there's a whole bunch of other ways to find submarines. Question? Are there some bombs that were left? I mean, nuclear bombs? Like nuclear bombs left on the bottom of the ocean? There's some submarines that are at the bottom of the ocean. Died. Oh, mines. Mines? Oh, you bet there's mines. Now, where they are becomes rather interesting. When I was in the United States military and I was flying B-52s, and it was actually harder than dropping regular bombs. The Navy wanted to know exactly where they were, and they wanted you to drop them in a straight line. One exactly the same, certain distance from the last one. Well, we pretended. We had a computer program in the airplane. Because the computer bombing system was a computer. Think about it like this. How long does it, if you buy a brand new computer today and you push the button, how long does it take till the screen's ready for you to type? If you bought it brand new and you put a bunch of programs on it and slowed it down. How long if you went and bought a brand new computer, really fast one, you push the on button, how many minutes would it take? If it was brand new and you hadn't installed anything, how many seconds would it take for it to boot up? How many people last year? So what do you think? Before you put anything on it? 10 to 15 seconds. Okay. The airplane I was flying, the computers were from 1983, even though I was flying them in the late 80s and the early 90s. It took 12 minutes. Huh? Yeah, we have to fly over the triangle. Yeah, on the charts we had, the triangles were the things you're going to blow up, or the places you were going to set the mines. Ask me sometime later in the semester about pretending to drop mines. The closest I ever got to dying in an airplane was simulating dropping mines on a training mission off the coast of Australia. But it was not. We did not have a fatal accident. I was not fatally injured. So you can launch ballistic missiles out of submarines. And look, here's an early one. Here's a, I don't think it's Polaris. I think this is the I can't remember the name of this missile. Darn. But this one actually launched out of a submarine. There's a really cool picture on the internet where they erased the submarine and they put an F-15 fighter jet. So they're trying to convince you that this F-15 fighter jet got launched out of a submarine, but it's not true. All right. So check this out. Air-to-ground nuclear missiles. Air-to-ground nuclear missiles, like an AGM-86 or an AGM-69. AGM stands for air-ground missile. So literally, these came out in the late 50s, early 60s. In fact, when I was in the service, and I bet you they still got them, we had short-range attack missiles and we had air-launched cruise missiles, and they had nuclear bombs on the end. So they were air-to-ground. You were in the air, you launched them, and they were designed to go and hit the ground. Nice thing is, let's just say you got a cruise missile. Let's say it'll go 800 miles. You get close to enemy territory, you launch it, and then you turn around and go the other way. That cruise missile, and the data I'm going to give you here is not classified, it'll descend down very low over the ground, like 200 feet, and it'll cruise along at 500 or 600 miles an hour. It's got a little jet engine in it, not a rocket. And there's a nuclear bomb on it. 800 miles. Heck, I don't think Korea's even 800 miles across, east and west. So you could get about 500 miles away from North Korea and launch it, turn around. Not that I think that's a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea. So here's a picture of a really early, this is a picture of a Hound Dog being dropped off of a B-52. This thing was huge. That thing under the bottom of the missile is actually the jet engine. And that thing's about 40 feet, maybe, yeah, at least 40 feet long. But this was made in the late 50s, early 60s. Cruise missiles now, they only have to be about 15 or 20 feet long. And they'll carry the same weapon. Because the engines don't have to burn as much fuel, and because they're more fuel efficient. Sea to ground. Okay, so here's an early one in the United States Navy. This actually was rocket launched, but it had a jet engine. This was the Regulus. It had a jet engine in it, and it's effectively, this was a drone. In fact, that other missile I just showed you was a drone. Once you launched it, though, you couldn't do anything about it. These missiles were designed that after you launched it, you can't do anything. Same thing for intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched missiles. Once you launch them, there's no extra button. You flip up the cover and push it and the missile blows up. No, they didn't have those. We still don't have those. The bombers, you could call them up and give them the secret code. Hey, Fred, turn around. What's the secret code? So they had to tell you, because you had the secret code in the airplane. There was actually a book. And at the top of each one was a secret code. So if you would hear that secret code, there was a lot of different ways. There's like 4 ways to get that code to the airplane. If you got that code, you'd flip open to that page, and then you would do whatever's on that page. And there was a page in there that said, "Turn around, come back, Fred. Don't drop the nukes, comma. Turn around. Don't drop the nukes." With an exclamation mark. Come back. It was pre-chat. We changed our minds. So, let's just say, I'm making this number up, let's just say this was 1960 when they did this. You think the Navy still has missiles that they can launch off of a ship that they can put a nuclear weapon on? I don't know. I haven't been keeping up on this sort of thing. The capabilities there, whether or not they do it or not, maybe be an interesting question. And okay, and I just wanted to spend a minute or two on the concept of nuclear mutually assured destruction. That's actually the most important thing on this slide. Has anybody ever heard of mutually assured destruction? Has anybody listened to that music group called Megadeth? Does anybody know Megadeth? Oh man, they got a great song. It's called Symphony of... If you like heavy metal from the 90s, then you would like Megadeth. If you don't like heavy metal from the 90s, then you wouldn't like them. But mutually assured destruction, sometimes it's abbreviated MAD, but I'm not going to ask you that on the test. Mutually assured destruction is a system whereby if you try to blow up my country with your nukes, I'm going to blow up your country with my nukes. And the try is the issue. Think about it like this. So you launch, let's say the Soviet Union back in the Cold War, between the late 1940s to 1991, they launch 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles from Russia, and they're coming towards the United States. And we've got the North Atlantic, oh shucks, I can't remember what NORAD is. But we got our radar sites in northern Canada, and we see all these intercontinental ballistic missiles coming. And we're going, ah! And we go tell the president, say, yo, Presidente, we got 100 ICBMs coming in from the commies. So we think we got to nuke them back. So the president said, yeah, let's nuke them back. So then we launch 200 ICBMs. And they don't hit each other in the sky because the sky's really big. What would happen in the United States if 100 ICBMs hit the United States? A lot of people would die. Yeah. Okay. But remember, how many nuclear warheads did each side have during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War? Does anybody remember what I said? Depending on what sources you read, there was about 20,000 warheads in the U.S. and about 20,000 warheads in the Soviet Union. Even if it was all half that. If you were going to do a thing, there's a thing called a first strike. Let's say you're so worried you think the other side is going to nuke you. So you decide you're going to nuke them first. You don't just send 100 intercontinental ballistic missiles. You launch 3/4 of what you got? What if 2,000 ICBMs got launched? 2,000. And they launched all their bombers, and let's say their bombers only had 20 warheads apiece. So now there's 5,000 warheads coming to the United States. And we pick up their airplanes on radar over Canada, and we pick up their ICBMs. Remember, their ICBMs only take 90 minutes to get here. So we got to decide pretty fast. Let's say it's 45 minutes after they launch, they're over the North Pole, we know they're coming. So we launch 5,000, we launch ICBMs, and we launch all of our airplanes on alert. So now we got 5,000 nukes going over that way. So let's don't think about 100 nuclear weapons exploding in the United States or 100 nuclear weapons exploding in the Soviet Union. Let's think about 5,000. And I'm not making these numbers up. Let's just be really conservative. Think about 1,000 nuclear weapons exploding in the United States. 1,000? Yeah, that's like 200 of them are going to land in California. 200 of them are going to land in California? Even if they only aimed them at U.S. military bases, can you say Fresno Air National Guard? You know what the Fresno Air National Guard is there for with those F-15s? So when the bad guy bombers are coming, they launch to shoot down the bad guy bombers. So guess what you might want to do is hit your ICBMs where all the fighter planes are that are going to come up and destroy your bombers, because your bombers are not going to show up in 90 minutes. They're just going to show up in 10 hours. They'll be here in 10 or 15 hours. So what do you want to do with your ICBMs? You want to try to blow up all the other guys' ICBMs, and you want to blow up nuclear airplane bases. You want to blow up all of their fighter jet bases so they can't shoot down your bombers when they get there. So where do you think all of our missiles are aimed? Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that because I got to used to look at the maps where the bombs and missiles went. But you can go reading, and there's military experts out there that'll give you their opinion. 1,000? Okay. So mutually assured destruction. Let me go back to that one. I know I'm ranting. We'll have a break here shortly. It's kind of fun. I like to rant. Mutually assured destruction means that if you try to attack me, I will attack you back. While though your weapons are still on the way, I'm going to launch all my weapons, or a whole bunch of them, thousands of them. And so that will deter you. That'll prevent you from that first strike. You won't do it. Because even if you think it's 2 a.m. in the morning and nobody's paying attention, we're paying attention. And they will wake the president up. And they will tell him, Mr. President, there's 3,000 ICBMs coming. You got to not nuke them back. So the Soviet Union didn't have a first strike on the U.S. because if they did, it would assure that they were destroyed as well. Mutually means both sides, and assured means for sure. So if either side launched first, the other side would still notice in time to launch most of their stuff, and now both countries would be a bunch of nuclear dust. I mean, let's say there's 300 million people in the United States. If we had 1,000 nuclear bombs, we'd probably have 10 to 50 million people alive after a few months, because a lot of people are going to die of radiation poisoning in the first few weeks of the first few months. We'd still have 10 or 20 or 30 million people left. So this was the theory, this was the basis of the Cold War, is we're going to have so many weapons that if they think they're going to blow us up, they're going to go, oh man, they got more weapons, or at least as many as we do. We'll blow them up back before we get destroyed. What a way to live for 40 years. Let's see, we'll say it's 11 after in real life, so 21 after on a real clock. We'll reconvene at 21 after.